welcome to Republican Gender Reveals, the legislative assaults on trans and non-binary youth. A special welcome to our speaker, Paisley Currah, and our moderator, Wendy Lee. I'm Sarah Gamble. I use she and her, and I run the Pembroke Public Health Collaborative here at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. The goal of the collaborative is to bring together the fields of gender and sexuality studies and public health. And this fall, we have a focus on trans youth. Trans Youth Now is a series of online events featuring prominent scholars in trans studies and trans health, speaking about existence and resistance in the anti-trans zeitgeist. I am so excited to welcome Paisley Currah for the third talk in this series. I'm also looking forward to the remaining talk on November 20th on gender-affirming care with Dr. Michelle Forcier, for which you can register online now. A housekeeping note, we encourage you to submit questions for Professor Currah using the Q&A function. We will address as many as we can in the time allotted. I'm going to briefly introduce our moderator, who will then introduce Professor Currah. Wendy Allison Lee is the Associate Director of the Pembroke Center here at Brown. She is also the Director of Undergraduate Studies and a lecturer in the Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Her teaching and research focus on questions of race, gender, and genre in Asian American literature and U.S. popular culture. Her writing has appeared in the academic journals Melis and Modern Language Quarterly and the digital magazines Avidly and Public Books. Wendy, thank you so much for moderating, and I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Welcome. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Paisley Currah, the third speaker in our Trans Youth Now series. Paisley Currah is a professor of political science and women's and gender studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Currah has written widely on transgender issues, including on topics such as discrimination, sex reclassification, and the transgender rights movement. With Susan Stryker, Currah co-founded the quarterly peer-reviewed journal TSQ, the Transgender Studies Quarterly, in 2014. TSQ is widely recognized as the leading journal in trans studies, and Currah served as the journal's co-editor from 2014 to 2019. Currah has advocated for transgender rights at all levels of government. He was a founding board member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, served on the founding board of directors of Global Action for Trans Equality, and sat on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch's LGBT program. Currah's most recent book is Sex Is, as Sex Does, Governing Transgender Identity, published in May 2022 by New York University Press. Sex Is, as Sex Does is quickly becoming a key text in the Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at Brown. Graduate students in the GNSS Method Seminar read the book in an early unit on Foundations of the Interdiscipline of Gender and Sexuality Studies, particularly during a week on category confusions. We also assign chapters from Sex Is, as Sex Does during the first week of our undergraduate course, Intro to GNSS. Paisley will briefly discuss the book in the first part of his talk, so I will not summarize it or go into much detail, but by way of commenting on it, I will share something briefly about teaching Sex Is, as Sex Does in the Intro to GNSS. I taught chapters from the book during the first week of class, and it reshapes the way many students think about sex. They find it surprising, sometimes challenging, but ultimately revelatory to reconsider how sex classification depends on what state you live in, what jurisdiction you were born in, and what government agency you're dealing with. And many of them return to an example that he shares of a woman in New York City who describes herself not as suffering from gender dysphoria, but as suffering from bureaucratic dysphoria. They're also pleasantly surprised by the humor Paisley occasionally and judiciously uses to reveal the injustices and inconsistencies of thinking about what sex does. Thank you, Paisley, for joining us today to talk about Republican Gender Reveals, the legislative assaults on trans and non-binary youth.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I want to thank Sarah Gamble and Wendy Lee and Diane Stryker and the Pembroke Center for inviting me, and I'm excited to be following two speakers who I know, Tay and Jules' work is so important to my own. And before I begin, I just want to give a land acknowledgement. I live and work on Lenape-Hoking, which is a traditional and unceded homeland of the Lenape, which includes the Canarsie Nation, which is sort of where I am. And the place where I work, in the city of New York, in the state of New York, and what we call the United States, exists because of settler colonialism, genocide, and the continuing exclusions and erasures of indigenous peoples. All right, so for my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, hopefully briefly, and then the next half is about a little bit about one way to look at what's going on with the attack on gender affirming care. And that stuff is super new and rough, but I hope to get have some interesting discussion about it. So the legislative assault on trans people in the United States that's currently underway, and I printed out my paper, I'm so old fashioned, but there I go. I'll try to hold it up a little bit. That's currently underway, seems new, but governments have actually been regulating the lives of transgender people for decades and decades, from bans on Medicare to contradictory rules on sex classification to all different kinds of policies around sex segregation. So, but outside of trans communities, few people were aware of this kind of Kafkaesque web of contradictions and regulations that trans people find ourselves in. But now that the policing of the gender binary has been transformed from an unremarkable aspect of bureaucratic policymaking into a weapon in the culture wars, everyone is paying attention. And in June, President Trump, who, whatever you might think of him, he has a sort of astute political sense. He said, "It's amazing how strongly people feel about that. I talk about cutting taxes, people goes like this," and he just kind of mimics kind of polite clapping. "I talk about transgender, everybody goes crazy. 5 years ago, you didn't know what the hell it was." So Trump echoes here what the findings of public opinion research. Transgender issues have become one of the most polarizing topics in the United States today. So a couple of things about the language. When I get to the second part of my talk, which is rough, I haven't really figured everything out yet. So I say we and they. So we is like me as a transgender rights advocate, as a transgender studies scholar. They is like really amorphous. It's Republicans, the right wing, the Pope, racial capitalism. It's all the baddies. I guess baddies has a different mood, but it's all the bad guys, but it's not very fine-tuned yet. So excuse me for the we, they stuff. And then I'm talking about sex and gender, the sex gender binary. In gender studies, we talk about the gender binary, and the they right-wing crowd, they talk about the sex binary. So I'm just going to say gender sex binary because to refer to the fact that I'm referring to the whole universe of discourse. So I just want to go over a little bit from the book I published last year, Sex is as Sex Does. And I'm going to do that by telling you a story about how I kind of figured out the main argument of the book. And it is a story, it could be a story about how brilliant I am, but it's really a story about how I'm a slow thinker. It took like 7 years for the penny to drop of doing this advocacy work to see what was really going on. And I kind of think of myself as a slow thinker, or not being very certain about things. And a friend of mine said, "Oh no, just think of it as like negative capability." And that sounds so much smarter. So you think about it, I didn't really have the answer. I had all these different possible interpretations of what was going on. Anyway, so in New York City, in the early 2000s, New York City imagines itself to be this progressive jurisdiction, but in the early 2000s, we still had this really kind of terrible policy on birth certificates. And I think I have a slide here to share with you. View slideshow. So in New York City in 2005, oops, sorry. Oh, my cat is stepping on my computer. This is the problem okay, sorry. I'm sorry about this. We didn't practice the cat interfering in the practice session. Anyways, so in 2005, New York City was in the situation of giving transgender people who requested new birth certificates this birth certificate. And this birth certificate looks fine, except if you look carefully, you realize it doesn't have a box for sex on it. So there's no box for sex. It would have been kind of where the arrow was. And at the bottom, it says, "This certificate is filed pursuant to subsection 5 of subsection A, blah, 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 blah," which is basically the transgender part of the city health code. So any government official or human resources worker would immediately know that this was a birth certificate of a transgender person. So I was invited to serve on this committee, as like, I never was quite sure if I was like a transgender expert or a transgender advocate or a transgender person, but here comes the cat. But I was invited to serve on this committee anyways, with Dean Spade and some transgender health people and some folks from the city Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. So these were the folks who are like, oh, we got to get a committee together. We got to get a better process for people changing their birth certificates, because just to get this terrible birth certificate, a trans person would have to get a letter from a psychiatrist, get a letter from a doctor, provide a report from a surgeon saying they had complete convertive surgery. So you'd have to do all this huge medical model work to change your gender, which many people didn't have access to or couldn't afford, just to get a certificate that didn't even say that you were M or F, even if you were asking for that. So, we got together with these bureaucrats and made lots of good arguments. You see, yeah, we would meet down at the New York City Department of Health. We'd make lots of good arguments about we need to have a standard that says gender identity would be the best metric for a change of sex. So people should just be able to come and fill out a form and have their birth certificate changed to match their gender identity. And there was lots of pushback. The committee had a lot of transgender advocates, but it also had some like health experts. And one fellow was a surgeon. And I like this story because it's a little bit of a kind of a Bruno Latour moment about how policy and science actually works. Like, he is a surgeon, so he works with trans people. His idea of the best metric for sex reclassification is, wait for it, surgery, right? So he thinks surgery should be the metric. But New York City Department of Health is way down on Chambers Street. Columbia's medical school is way up. It's even further than Columbia. It's like 168th Street. So he only came to one meeting because he couldn't make money. He was taking the subway back and forth, or probably cabs. He'd lose a day just to come to a meeting. So he only came to one meeting. So it seemed like his view wasn't going to prevail, which was great. So eventually we got this committee to agree to propose a change in the city's health code so that your gender identity could be the metric for a change of sex on your identity documents. And that seemed great. And then they proposed this. We had this proposal, and then we didn't hear from them. Nothing happened. We didn't hear from them at all. Finally, we did hear back from them, and we were like, okay, so we're going to go forward with this? They're like, no. We shopped your proposal around to different city agencies, and we decided that we couldn't go with it. We couldn't have a gender identity standard because the Department of Homeless Services was fine with it, but the Corrections Department wasn't, the police wasn't. Every department had a different view about what they want to see as a metric for sex classification. So we were like super disappointed about this outcome. We were very disappointed, and it just seemed like transphobia. It just seemed like mean, just not caring about the interests and the needs of transgender people who are born in the city who should have been entitled to a new birth certificate. And so that was that. They basically passed a policy that said you can get a new birth certificate that does have a sex classification on it, if you have complete surgery, like all the surgeries you could possibly have, and general surgery and so on. And that was a teeny improvement, but most people couldn't take advantage of that policy because a lot of people couldn't afford or didn't want the kind of surgery they asked for. So it was not a good policy. And it wasn't until like a few years later that the penny dropped from me about what was actually going on. This group, the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund, sued the city, and they said this policy is mean. Of course, when lawyers say mean, they have lawyer language. So lawyer language for mean is arbitrary, irrational, and capricious. So what they were suggesting was that this policy makes no sense because trans people can change their driver's license based on their gender identity in the state. Why wouldn't the city also let the people change their birth certificates? It just seems like to arbitrarily be picking on transgender people, and it's just capricious. There's no logic to it. And it's only when I read the city's responding brief that I understood what had been really going on. I'm just skipping this. And this is like not a very, this to me was a huge aha moment, but it's the most boring legal prose you could ever see. But basically what the city was arguing in its brief is they said, actually, the fact that different agencies do different things and have different criteria for changing sex doesn't mean our policies are irrational. different. So then it was like, what? This was totally making me rethink the problem I was looking at, because I thought we were talking about sex classification. And the city was talking about like what sex classification does at particular agencies, and sex is operationalized. That's a terrible word. Sex is defined differently at different agencies depending on what the agency does. And that to me is like when I started to really understand, it's like, oh, transphobia is probably a good word. It's probably a good word to understand the effects of these policies, but it might not be the best analytical frame for understanding what's actually going on. So for the book, there's all these debates about what sex is. For the book, I say sex, for the purpose of this thought experiment of the research that I was doing, is just defined as the outcome of a government decision. Like, and the state in political science is like, the state is something that has a power to punish you. So the state is an entity that is backed by the force of law. So sex is just effectively a government decision. And that made me, that opened up a lot of different kinds of analysis. One of the things that I had been working on, and this is, when I first started this research project, was trying to keep track of all the different sex classification policies all over the United States. It was this crazy Excel document. It was unmanageable. I hardly understood Excel, but it had every state, every different driver's license, birth certificate, government, jail policy on sex classification, court decisions on sex classification and marriage. And I was trying to see some kind of logic in it, like other than and most of my analysis at that time would be like there were different kinds of transphobia, or there was an absence of transphobia. But after I read this brief from the government, I started to see some patterns in the sex classification stuff. So for example, one of the things I saw was that driver's license policies were much easier to change, even in what we now call red states. One could change your driver's license policy, and driver's licenses, DMVs, were also quicker to drop kind of onerous obstacles like surgery for getting your sex reclassified. So that was interesting. And another thing I noticed is that when it came to like marriage, and this was when there was still a ban on same-sex marriage. When it came to marriage, appellate courts were ruling that someone's legal sex for the purpose of marriage was set at birth. So these trans people who had changed all their identity documents and changed their passports and changed all this stuff, they, for some reason or other, the status of their marriage would get litigated, sometimes through death and probate courts, or sometimes through custody battles and marriage battles, when their sex would be set at birth for the purposes of marriage. And so let me see, I can change the slide. So for example, here's the case of Christy Lee Littleton. Her husband died in Texas, and she sued the doctor, and the doctor's insurance company basically came up with this argument that said, actually, Christy Lee Littleton was assigned female at birth. They didn't put it that way. Christy Lee Littleton was male at birth. Therefore, she is still a man. Therefore, her marriage, or his marriage, they would say, to a man in the state of Texas is not allowed. Is not a legitimate marriage. Therefore, she has no standing to sue. And an appellate court in Texas agreed. They said, in the language of Texas judicial rhetoric, they said, a surgeon doesn't have the power. A surgeon can't change with a scalpel what God created at birth. So those of you who are thinking about this whole separation of church and state thing, it's not really happening so much that in Texas judicial rhetoric. So I started to understand, like, oh, when it comes to marriage, sex serves this kind of different function. But when it comes to this is my picture of marriage, what the function marriage does. I never could find the best piece of art, but marriage is about, popular culture might say marriage is about like romance and love, but we sort of understand marriage to be a legal instrument to regulate the transmission of property over generations, over time. It's also instrumental in like race and nation building. So so sex classification serves a different purpose, but when it comes to driver's licenses, it's actually in the interest of the state for people to carry driver's licenses that accurately, reflect how they present themselves. So if I get pulled over in New York State, it's not really particularly useful for the state if I hand over a driver's license that says F on it. So even though I might have thought, oh, New York State has a non-transphobic DMV policy, it's actually it was more kind of the reason of the state for it to recognize people's gender change for the purposes of surveillance and tracking an individual over a given territory. So anyways, that's some of the arguments from the book. The basic point is that like in talking about the policy of sex classification, one of the basic points is like myself and my colleagues, we went in talking about these ideal definitions of sex, and sex is really gender, and gender can be best way to measure it as gender identity. So we were kind of the land of like definitions and Plato, an ideal way of thinking about things. And the government bureaucrats sitting across the table from us, they were the true Foucauldians. They were the ones like saying, pshaw, we don't care about what the final definitions. We care about how it's going to affect the workings of government. Okay, so now I want to kind of switch over. I'll stop sharing for a second. Switch over and talk about the particular moment we find ourselves in, because we are this crazy moment where in 2015 we had 19 anti-trans bills introduced in the United States. In 2023 we have so far this year 583, and that is a 3,000% increase in the number of bills. So as you know, we have bills regulating gender classification on identity documents, the use of bathrooms, participation in sports, support for trans kids in schools, the presence or absence of trans or queer-related literature in libraries, and access to gender-affirming care. So if you want to get a sense of if you want to have a look at that, a really good place to look is this thing called the Movement Advancement Project. They have all these maps. You go up here and you kind of look at you choose an issue and you get the right map. So this map right now is for gender affirming care. So there are 21 states that have passed legislation banning gender affirming care. Some of those bans have been stopped temporarily because they're going through litigation, but there are 21 states. And these bills range from the unnecessary to the mean-spirited to the nonsensical. So like the unnecessary would be they're all unnecessary and mean-spirited and nonsensical. But for example, if like in Utah, we had the legislature passed a ban on trans girls playing on girls' teams and girls' sports. And the governor of Utah, whose name is, I forget his first name, Governor Cox, he vetoed the bill. This Republican governor of Utah vetoed this bill. He did some research and he said there are 75,000 students who play sports in Utah high schools, and he found one transgender girl that he could identify, and no issues have been raised about her participation. So he actually said in his veto statement, rarely has so much fear and anger been directed at so few. And then of course the Utah legislature went over and overrode his veto. In other states like Kansas and Montana and Tennessee have passed bills that would change sex classification identity documents. So it would be much more difficult, if not impossible, to change the sex on your identity document. And people who have previously changed the sex classification on their identity document, when they go to renew their identity document, they might have been living in their new gender for decades. They're going to get a driver's license in the mail sent back to them that lists their birth sex. Then we have all the bathroom bills, which are part of the moral panic as well, which are not. There's all this kind of talk of the fear of sexual assault in bathrooms, and the people who are being assaulted in bathrooms are now the gender nonconforming people as a result of these bills. Okay, so what underrates this attack? I mean, in some sense, this kind of Republican anti-gender campaign, anti-transgender campaign, is part of their larger assault on movements for social justice, all falling under this kind of increasingly widespread umbrella term woke or wokeness. But what I want to do is I want to think through what's going on, looking at the gender sex binary, and I kind of think of this as like a fugue, as like trying doing it one time and doing it a second time, and both accounts are true, but one might be have a little more different resonances than the other. So the current debate around transgender issues, it seems to center on disagreements over the meaning of male and female. So the conservatives lean hard on the notion of sex difference. There's only human females and human males, and sex is fixed at birth. So researchers in gender studies and trans rights advocates, we respond with claims about the mutability of sex and gender, and we argue that the sex assigned at birth it shouldn't be determinative in terms of one's legal rights, or it is not determinative in terms of our social roles as male or female. So we see this in social media and in op-eds. Anti-trans movements litigate seemingly endlessly this kind of correct answer to like, what is a woman? And so the right wing, I can't remember, it was I can't remember the organization, but they had this video called "What is a Woman?" that like over 100 million people have watched, and it has Matt Walsh walking around asking people what is a woman, and he answers the question at the very end of the film. He's in the kitchen with his wife, and he says to his wife, "What is a woman?" And she says, "A woman is an adult human female." And then she says, "And can you open this jar?" Because she's too weak to open it. So that's the happy ending of the film. This kind of nice kind of domesticity. So that's so it's always, the battle seems to be about these definitions of sex and gender. So let's turn specifically now to gender affirming care. And I just thought I'd focus on Mike Johnson because he is the man of the hour. He is the man of the hour. I gotta find my Chrome thing here. There we go. He's the newly elected Speaker of the House. So I think this should work. I have it queued up. Hopefully it'll work. This is Mike Johnson.
About 15 minutes ago, it's been plenty observed and fully respected by every culture for all of recorded history. Sex isn't something you are assigned at birth. It's a natural prenatal development that occurs when every unborn child is in mother's womb. No one can surgically free themselves from this subjective and obvious fact of life, or free anyone else from it.
Okay, so it's hard.
Today,
oh, sorry.
You see adults inflicting unspeakable harm.
Sorry, I have too many buttons going on. It's hard to hear, but I can read the quote. So he says, "Sex isn't something you're assigned at birth. It is a prenatal development that occurs when every unborn child is in its mother's womb. You can't surgically free yourself or someone else from this fact of life." However, we see adults inflicting harm on helpless children to affirm their worldview, that is, gender is fluid, sex can be surgically altered, and that there are no lasting consequences as a result of these gender transition processes. So then he goes on and talks about the reach of gender identity politics. And this is a hearing that was held in the House in the summer about gender affirming care. So it's kind of frightening that this fellow is in charge of the House. So the right-wing position on the sex-gender binary is that there are only two sexes. Sex is fixed at birth or conception, I guess. There's no meaningful difference between sex and gender. In fact, gender itself is a problematic term in that it suggests there's something different going on. Clearly from that follows that same-sex marriage is wrong, homosexuality is wrong, definitely transgender people don't really exist, and gender affirming care for anyone, but especially for youth, has to be outlawed. So from the trans side, legal advocates respond by pointing out the overwhelming support of the scientific establishment of gender dysphoria. We argue that parents, not the government, are best situated to make medical decisions for their children. And outside the legal atmosphere, we also see arguments about refusing the imposition of conventional norms on bodies, identities, and social arrangements, and the importance of gender self-determination. So this is an important battle to wage, and if we can talk about some of the pros and cons of the different types of arguments that you like in the Q&A. I just want to say a few more things about this kind of right-wing position on sex difference. Like, one, it's not just difference, but hierarchy. Hierarchy is central to their idea of sex difference. And let me give you some quotes. Men and women complement each other, each with their own prescribed roles. And complementarity, according to this is now some documents from the Vatican, which is sort of the fount of a lot of the gender ideology work. Complementarity does not imply subordination. Um, and I'll give you a couple of more quotes. The complementarity of men and women, the pinnacle of divine creation, is being questioned by the so-called gender ideology, that would be me, in the name of a more free and just society. The differences between men and women are not for opposition or subordination, but for communion and generation, always in the image and likeness of God. There's lots of quotes that we could talk about, and they say complementarity is not really about subordination. But the people who are promulgating this sort of thought of sex difference come from institutions that by law and custom do not allow women to be leaders. So I think we can see that complementarity does probably involve subordination. So we have sex fixed at birth, heterosexuality is the only option, separate spheres for men and women, as you see in the rhetoric, almost this kind of cult of domesticity. It's really sort of like old-fashioned 19th century difference feminism, but maybe without the feminism. We see the celebration of womanly virtues in this discourse. The womanly virtues would be piety, purity, domesticity, and submission. And I just want to point out, let me get down here a little bit, point out like Mike Johnson, here we go. Mike Johnson's wife couldn't go to the ceremony where he's voting as House Speaker because she spent the last couple of weeks on her knees in prayer to the Lord, and she's a little worn out. Like, I just leave that with you, but there's a lot of gender difference happening there. Okay, so in terms of legal recognition, trans people were accidental beneficiaries. This is part of my first book again, of the feminist movement. But in our current moment, the tail is wagging the dog. A targeted attack on trans people, who are a very small part of the population, seek to undermine feminist achievements in general. An attack on trans people is part of the attack on gender equality, and the idea is to bring hierarchy back in. So remember, gender can only endure as an engine of inequality if the distinction between men and women is like inviolate, remains intact. Okay, so just to sum up where we are so far, it's important to counter right-wing constructions of sex difference because the policy consequences are bad. Denial of gender-affirming care, criminalization of same-sex sex, that's what Mike Johnson wants to go back to, the end of same-sex marriage, attacks on reproductive rights, the reinscription of gender norms. Just Department of Agriculture in Texas last spring, they had this memo. It's sort of their anti-trans moment. They're like, oh, and you have to wear clothes that are associated with your biological sex. So they're trying to say trans people have to like wear the clothes associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. But what that also does, it just shows how this is kind of going to also hurt just gender equality per se. What it also does is it mandates that like women, cis and trans women, but I think cis women are kind of follow the analysis often. So women are also going to have to like wear clothes traditionally coded as feminine. So this, you can't really separate the anti-trans attack from the anti-feminist attack. Okay, so the final part of this talk, I'm going to kind of come back one more time and think about gender difference in a slightly different way. So the right wing insists that it's given, and the biology is the foundation. And you know, we have Ann Foster. It's kind of nervous saying anything about sex with Ann Foster Sterling in the audience, but I will. I'll just have to live with that. So the right wing insists that it's given, and biology is the foundation. And of course, on our side, we argue that it's not. That birth sex does not account for gender or gender identity or gender nonconforming practices. That sex is not a biological entity, that it's a name for an aggregate of characteristics that aren't as dimorphic as people think. So against the immutability of a sex binary and sex difference, we talk about gender as a continuum, about gender pluralism, or even gender abolition. Against the idea of hierarchy, well, we don't really talk about this as much as we should, but if we did, we kind of respond with gender neutrality, like things to be gender neutral, if not completely abolished. So in some sense, though, I think we're taking the Republicans at their word. The right wing, the Republicans, the bad guys, that the sex binary is for them the ultimate cause of our policy disagreements. And I think make that assumption limits our politics in not good ways. Okay, so circling back to the beginning, just remember in doing this work on sex classification, I had realized that for state actors, they weren't thinking about sex as they weren't in practice thinking about sex as some ideal thing in itself. they were thinking of it as how it would matter in a particular context, how sex classification matters, the DMV or jails or homeless shelters or for welfare, etc. So for government, sex is an output of government, an effect, and how it's defined depends on the particular state project, from identity documents to marriage. But that's also true for the sex gender binary. So in practice, it's also much more protean. And obviously we know that, but I'm saying the other side of things know that. So let's consider a couple of policies. We have 21 states that have banned gender-affirming care for trans youth. That's with horrific effects. According to the Williams Institute, this could put more than 144,000 trans youth it could cause them to lose or be at risk of losing access to gender-affirming care. Here's another policy I want to talk about that's different. During the height of the COVID pandemic, the federal government expanded the child tax credit. Don't get bored. It sounds boring talking about taxes, but it raised the amount of tax credits and made them refundable. No single policy has done so much to lift children out of poverty. It halved the child poverty level. 3.7 million children were lifted out of poverty. So it was a very good policy for a year. Last year, the Republicans, along with Senator Joe Manchin, killed it. They let it lapse. So child poverty has gone back up again. So in talking about the bans on gender-affirming care and this child tax credit policy, I am not in any way suggesting some sort of zero-sum game. I'm not suggesting that the universal policy is more important than the one affecting a smaller segment of the population, not at all. I just want to use these examples to say that the work that the gender binary does is shifts. So its status as immutable justifies the ban on gender-affirming care. In that sense, legislating that sex at birth is sex for life is one small but essential part of the entire sex difference cosmology, which includes different gender roles, complementarity, women's domesticity, possibly subordination. But the sex gender binary, which is supposedly the foundation for all the good things in the Republican political imagination, like a family with one wage earner and another parent providing care in the home, actually is much less important when it comes to labor. So one reason that Manchin and others killed the child tax credit was, and I looked this up and it was just kind of perfect, there's this institution at the University of Chicago called the Becker-Friedman Institute. So named after Gary Becker and Milton Friedman, who are the architects of neoliberalism. So their institute, they're long gone, but did a report warning that the child tax credit provides an incentive for people to stay home. And of course, isn't that supposed to be a good thing? But anyways, and exit the labor force and drive up wages. Before the COVID era expanded tax credit was passed, this institute warned that the change in policy would lead to 1.5 million workers leaving the workforce, which is bad because when there's a tighter labor market, wages go up, and that's terrible. But in fact, of course, as people, as Hortense Spillers, Riley Snorton, Sally Markowitz, and so many others have pointed out, not to mention Sojourner Truth, it's not just gender studies people that understand gender to be fungible, as not fixed and not binary. The versatility of sex gender regimes as technologies of governing is also well within the wheelhouse of racial capitalism. And we can see this over and over again. For example, you all know the gender arrangements of English common law were rewritten in the United States and the colonies for enslaved people. So in England, the father's status determined a child's birth rate. In Virginia and later in other states, the legal convention was rewritten to ensure that the children of the enslaved African women would inherit their mother's status. As Tara Hunter points out, the ideology of race trumped the ideology of domesticity. The machinery of enslavement, welfare, and tax policy, there are so many times, perhaps the majority, when the needs of capital for labor prevail. So for working class women, for women of color, the ideals of gender difference, sexual dimorphism are quickly tossed away. So just to conclude, I would just want to say it's important to understand how the gender binary offers ideological resources to the right and to provide counter arguments. But it's also vital that we not get drawn so deep into their rhetoric that it becomes their entire universe, and that we neglect to pay attention to other processes and structures that went into its production. So in some sense, the practice, if not in thought, at least in practice, the right has always been beyond sexual dimorphism. But our academic penchant for deconstructing binaries sometimes keeps us trapped within those very binary logics. So I'll end there and look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Paisley. I'm going to kick off our Q&A and let people let their thoughts marinate. And I encourage people in the audience to type their questions in the Q&A. I think I'll just start off by bringing us back to the title of your talk, Republican Gender Reveals, and invite you to say a little bit more about that, because as I was preparing your introduction, I was actually thinking about the sort of great collection of TikToks and YouTube videos of gender reveal parties gone wrong. And, the sort of joke that people sharing them will say is that gender is dangerous to the environment. The gender reveal parties where someone shoots off a cannon and then it starts a wildfire. So I was curious to hear a little bit more about the idea of a gender reveal. The Mike Johnson quote that you shared about his insistence that sex is not assigned at birth, it's prenatal. So just an invitation to talk more about the title and the idea of a Republican gender reveal.
Yeah, well, I guess it's on a couple of different layers. And when you once asked to give a title, you give a title and then you're like, oh, let me think of a talk later. So, but I was like Wendy, though, I was like entranced by this idea of like forest fires starting. Like I think one California huge forest fire was a result of a gender reveal rocket or something, and there was a big accident in Long Island. So I was struck by that in the sense that I'm interested in like looking at things that don't go together, like there's the sex difference and then like the forest fire architecture, but also as I kind of worked with it, so I just thought that was a cute title and I could maybe do something with it, which I didn't really do. But also like I also want to reveal the fact that like this is kind of a messy part of my thought right now, because I just say the bad guys, the right, Republicans. That's not, needs to be better. But the Republicans, they're also kind of, if you look at their policies, if you look at what they do and not what they say, they're also kind of revealing their own understanding of the fungibility of gender. Like, so we keep arguing with them as if like they really believe that, in some sense rhetorically, of course. I'm sure Mike Johnson does, but we also have to look at like how the gender binary is ignored in so many different kind of state projects. So good question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I also wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about the shift that maybe a shift that I saw from your book, Sex Is and Sex Does. I mean, it seems like eons ago now, May 2022, where all of your examples are of adult, I think primarily your examples are of adult trans people navigating the inconsistencies. And there's, as a nod to our series, there seems to be a shift in the zeitgeist to the focus of the figure of the trans child or trans kids. But I think what your talk is pointing us to is how, and this is maybe a connection to Lee Edelman's work on the child. Yeah. It's not about the actual children, it's about what the sort of, if sex classification is about what the category of sex does for a government agency, I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about what the figure of the child does. The child generally and the trans child in particular.
Yeah, I didn't have time to get into that, but I'm glad you asked. And I'm also glad I didn't really get into it because I realized that Jules Gill Peterson spoke, and I love her work so much because she has this, I don't know how much in her book. I think she also tweeted it, but also in her book, she has this kind of reading of Sedgwick. Sedgwick's got this great important piece about how like on how like gay children are being erased by this discourse of gender identity, and how that becomes this kind of fundamental kind of moment in queer theory. And Jules points out that like actually that's like a moment where like the existence of transgender people are being erased. So but what I think is there's a couple of things. So what's so interesting about the figure of the child, because it operates in two registers always. There's the rhetoric register that Lee Edelman talks about as like the future. And then there's also just the actual people, actual children who are harmed by these policies. And I think like just paying attention to those to the oscillation between those is so important. But then I kind of got off track when I was writing this. I was going to do this kind of Edelman, Sedgwick, Gil Peterson, Dorothy Roberts thing. And then I kind of got off track and I was thinking about, well, you can't really think about the child without thinking about work and all the labor that for some reason, well, you could ask Sylvia Federici, but for some reason becomes invisible when children are involved. So I started thinking like the figure of the child is always kind of accompanied by like this invisible labor, like expropriation of somebody's labor. So I wanted to kind of have a kind of like a Federici, Sophie Lewis kind of moment talking about care work and family abolition. So.
Great, thank you. And now we have our first question from someone in the audience. So Paisley, thinking more about sex as an output for government, can you speak more about this sort of, quote, surveillance limbo that is being created for trans people when they're forced to carry ID with their birth sex while they're being, quote, seen by the state as their outward gender identity?
Yeah, I mean, so what I argue in the book is that even though trans people are often harmed by state policies, there's sometimes a larger rationale that we can identify. And it wasn't to suggest that if there's a bad policy that harms transgender people, we should just put up with it. It was like, we need to understand what states are doing at a much more kind of granular level, because to challenge issues around gender and sex classification, we have to kind of get much more deeper into the mechanics of the state. So, but the driver's license policies sort of made sense. Like you could basically change it. And now these policies are so just mean, like in Kansas, Montana, I forget the other one, Tennessee or Kentucky. They're just, and there's more probably that are going to be passed. They don't really make any sense in terms of policy. So a long time ago, I wrote an article which I thought was out of date, but it'll come back in date, which is about like gender surveillance at the airport. Because there are these different mechanisms of gender surveillance. There's that machine that you get coded as pink or blue, whatever that machine is. I forget what it's called. And then there's the technology of the identity document. So if the identity document didn't match, or if your presentation didn't match, and this is going to bring that back to the fore, where like people are going to be hassled and questioned, and in terms of the kind of the smooth working of capitalism, it's going to be a lot more messy. This is in some sense a transition from like a kind of representative kind Obama era neoliberalism to a more kind of patriarchal traditional neoliberalism of surveillance and punishing.
Thank you. Okay, I have another question for you. In addition to the proliferation of anti-trans policies and laws, there's been what feels like a 1,000,000% increase in accusing parents and medical providers of, quote, grooming if they support their trans kid. What is this about? What might be the legal implications?
Yeah, it's the legal implications, like, you know, all these kind of a lot of these bad policies are being challenged in courts. And what's really interesting about the challenges in court is that I have a good friend who's one of these litigators, and like they get Trump appointed federal judges, and they just sort of like lay out, they get the trans kid and their family there, and then kind of lay out all the 22 major medical associations that support transgender people and so on. And they're kind of, in these cases, they're often winning against Trump judges. So when you have a moment to kind of present judges with actual people, and then behind those people, you have all these kind of expert discourses supporting that, it's okay. But as it gets to the Supreme Court, towards the Supreme Court, who will know what will happen. At another level, though, like, it's like nonsensical. Like, it doesn't make sense to see like gender transition is about sexuality, like, but that nonsensicality, the fact that it makes no sense, it doesn't matter, you know, like that's a logic thing. And moral panics don't operate on logic. They operate on like the stickiness of gender and sexuality as like what Foucault would call dense sites for the transmission of power. So it's just like bringing back an old trope from the anti-gay moment in the 1970s. Like drag queen reading hour being a moment of grooming. It makes no sense, but it there's something about it that makes sense to enough people. So I don't know if that's a great answer, but just giving a logical answer in the kind of moral panic cultural moment sometimes is not enough.
Thank you. Actually, as you were speaking, it occurs to me during your talk, when you were saying the meanness and the illogic, and it seems to, and I'm actually forgetting who said this, but the idea that the cruelty is the point,
Yeah.
that for the people who believe in this and want this kind of surveillance, and I like to, in the audience question, surveillance limbo, the surveillance and the cruelty is the point of it, and there's a sort of almost sense of like cheering on for the cruelty.
Yeah, and that's kind of in line with like the general, I was doing some research on public opinion, and like the stuff around the Trump election and between 2016 2020, there's just a huge increase in like overt racism and overt sexism in the rhetoric. I think people would say it called the Overton window, whatever. But like what is considered acceptable political discourse is just so much more moved to the right. And I think the attacks on transgender people have to be seen in the sense of that larger move as well.
All right. Are there any other additional questions from our audience? And I know it is, for those that are teaching in academic spaces, it is definitely the part of the semester where there's a lot going on. Okay, well, I will ask another question. I want to give people time, but I can also talk to you for a really long time as well. I actually wanted to hear you say more about the connections you saw between the next book you're working on and Dorothy Roberts in particular on questions of reproductive justice.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated by that because, well, I mean, the empirical problem that Dorothy Roberts talks about is so important, and she's doing such a great job in raising that. But it sort of is contradictory to a lot of the trans rights discourse we see, right? So when we talk about, and also certain strands of feminism right now, so we talk about like family abolition, and so I just like in queer and trans advocacy around youth, like the kind of the classic figure sometimes is the runaway who has to be supported, and in the kind of racialized use of child protective services, it's judging Black families as less worthy of the rights of parenting. So like there's a certain kind of clash happening, and I don't exactly know how to figure it out. But one thing what I have seen, and I actually quoted it, and maybe I didn't quote it today, I can't remember, but it's the transgender rights response to the bans on gender affirming care, which is to say, don't take these decisions out of the hands of parents, that it's parents' rights. And technically, there is a 14th Amendment right to control your kid's health care that courts have found, unless you're making really crazy, stupid decisions like that where they will die or something. But and so these policies are putting the state in place of parents. So that seems worse, though. I don't know. It'd be interesting to kind of think about it in a larger group or discuss, because the parents' rights discourse doesn't exactly always feel like the right answer as well. So there's lots of interesting currents happening in that area.
Great, thank you. And we have another question from the audience. What are your thoughts about the inclusion of communities of color? What are your thoughts about the inclusion of communities of color in this discourse? I find that with so many issues of racism, immigration, poverty, violence, these important issues of transgender rights are left behind. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's very important when, like, all the things, right? Like, we have to care about transgender women of color and transgender people of color. But I think even before we get to that, we start thinking with the sex binary, like, we need to understand how it was always a white racial project. I'm teaching this feminist theory class, and I was just teaching this week this really great article by Sally Markowitz from Science, like 20 years ago, about the racial origins of the sex binary. And it's just so important for us always to remember that these discourses of like sex difference were always constructed through racial categories because they were, there's lots of folks who read on this, but I like that Markowitz piece. Ideals of sex difference kind of really radically changed when European culture came in contact with cultures they were soon going to colonize. So we can't think about these things without thinking about the sex binary. And that Markowitz article, she starts her article with that Sojourner Truth quote, "Ain't I a woman?" And I started cringing. It's like, oh, a women's studies article that starts with Sojourner Truth quote. That's so women's studies. And then by the time you work through the article, you're like, oh, I see why she talked about that, because she talks about she's not talking about trans stuff, but she talks about like how welfare policy is dictated by the needs of the labor market, not any kind of ideal of domesticity, right? So we always have to kind of remember that, like, when we're talking about the sex binary, for Republicans, the sex binary goes along with gender norms and certain ideas about who should be working and who should be in the home. So like that's always already racialized. So I think we need to bring race in at the very beginning of our analysis when we're even thinking about these categories. So as I ended my talk talking about this binary, if we stay within the Republican, if we stay on their terms talking about the gender binary, it's getting used in racialized ways, but it's not explicitly talked about that way. So that cuts our ability, that harms our ability to actually bring race into the analysis if we stay on their terms.
Great. Question. Thank you so much.
All right. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have with Professor Currah today. I want to thank him and Wendy for sharing so generously of their time, as well as all the folks behind the scenes who helped make this happen. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.